We cannot leave our study of kinetics, though, without consideration of that last factor from very early on. Okay, we said there were various factors that affected the rate of reaction. We looked at concentration and derived the rate law. We looked at temperature, introduced the idea of activation energy, and showed how changing the temperature can affect the rate of the reaction by changing the number of collisions that beat the activation energy. And we demonstrated that numerically using the Arrhenius equation. Well, the last factor was a catalyst. A catalyst speeds up a reaction. Indeed, what you learn in baby science is a catalyst is a substance that speeds up the rate of a reaction without being consumed itself. Well, that's a horrible definition. It's not completely inaccurate, but it's a horrible definition. So let's see if we can't, with one example, generate a better definition of a catalyst. Let's consider this reaction here, a so-called dehydration, because we're losing water, of an alcohol. Okay, this reaction, in this particular case ethanol losing water to make ethene, is very, very, very slow. And the reason it is very, very, very slow is because it has a very, very high activation energy. Okay, once the reaction is there, it's there, but to get it there, very slow, very long time, because it has a very high activation energy. In other words, very few collisions have sufficient energy to break that bond. However, if you add in a small amount of H+, a small amount of an acid, and that's what this is indicating here. The acid is not a reactant, it's not a product, it's there associated with the reaction. And usually when you put a substance here on the arrow that's associated with the reaction, you're indicating that it is a catalyst. Do this reaction with a small amount of acid catalyst and it goes much faster. Now the reason for that is that when you have that acid catalyst, you're not relying on the reaction breaking this bond between the carbon and the OH group. What you do is you affect the actual structure of the reactant. In this particular case, the H+ reacts with the alcohol to give you this intermediate, as it's called. Okay, now this intermediate, it's got a carbon bonded to an oxygen, but now that oxygen has got that extra hydrogen on there. Makes it much easier to do this step. Instead of it being the OH that you have to break the bond, it makes this H2O that can go quite happily. Okay, and you make another intermediate here. Well, that intermediate here can quite easily break apart to give you the other product, the ethene plus the H+. You started with H+, it got involved and got consumed, but then got produced again at the end. Now when we plot out the energy profile diagram for this particular process, what do you see about it? It's an alternative process that has a much smaller activation energy. What a catalyst does, it is a substance that provides an alternative pathway with a lower activation energy, thus speeds up the reaction. Within that alternative pathway, the catalyst is involved, it is consumed, but then it is generated again before the end. So it looks like it hasn't been consumed at all. Okay, catalyst used up, made again, provide an alternative pathway with a lower activation energy. Fancy way for pathway is mechanism. You'll be talking about mechanisms in organic chemistry. The way mechanisms are studied is via kinetic approaches. There are different types of catalysts. Homogeneous catalyst, that's catalyst in the same phase as the reactants. That's usually in solution. So our previous example would happen in solution. You would have the alcohol in the solution, the acid in the solution, do the reaction. Heterogeneous catalysts, in which the catalyst is in a different phase from the reaction. This is usually where you have a solid catalyst and gases or liquids over those solids, and what happens usually is that the reactant can bond to the solid. That can help it break the bonds so that then the other reactants can come in and do the reaction. A lot of times then these solids are metals, and you'll study these a bit in organic chemistry and an awful lot in inorganic chemistry. You will also study in your biological chemistry enzymes. These are large proteins, okay, that have small cavities or holes or gaps in which smaller molecules can fit to do the reactions. They are homogeneous because they're in the cells. In your cell, you don't have little solid lumps of stuff floating around. Fun stuff to study. Their kinetics is a special type of kinetics, all of which you'll touch upon next year. Well, hopefully you've enjoyed our little foray into chemical kinetics. Important things to get out of it: the idea of what kinetics are, the three factors that we talked about that will affect it, generation of a rate law, understanding of the importance of activation energy, understanding of how the temperature will affect the speed of a reaction, not because it changes the activation energy, but it changes the proportion of molecules of collisions that either have or do not have the kinetic energy enough to beat the activation energy. And then finally, an understanding of catalysts. Catalysts are substances that provide a different pathway, a different mechanism for the reaction, that have a lower activation energy.